Growing up, Aaron always thought of his sister, Jenna, as the responsible one. She was older, always organized, and seemed to have life figured out. Their childhood home, an old Victorian house with creaky floorboards and dim lighting, had always been a source of comfort despite its eerie ambience. However, one fateful night in February of 2024 would forever change Aaron's perception of his home and what lay within it. Aaron was a 21-year-old college student on winter break. His parents were away on a much-deserved vacation, and Jenna had moved out a few years earlier. Left alone, Aaron relished the quiet time, immersing himself in his favorite hobby, sketching. That particular evening, he was sprawled out on the living room couch, pencil in hand, sketching a surreal portrait of a stormy sea. The house was silent, save for the occasional creaks from the old wooden structure adjusting to the cold. A faint draft swept through the hallways, rattling the curtains. Aaron barely noticed. He was engrossed in his drawing. That was until he heard it, a soft, familiar voice. "Aaron? Hey, are you home?" He froze mid-stroke, his heart skipping a beat. It was Jenna's voice, unmistakable, carrying that same slightly teasing tone she used when trying to get his attention. Confused, he set his sketchbook aside and sat up. "Jenna," he called back, his voice echoing down the hall. No response. Aaron stood, hesitating for a moment. He hadn't seen Jenna in weeks, and she hadn't mentioned she'd be visiting. His footsteps echoed as he walked down the dimly lit hallway, checking the front door. Locked. The windows were latched too. He shook his head, wondering if he'd imagined it. But then, he heard it again. "Aaron, I'm downstairs." This time, her voice sounded closer, as if it were coming from the basement. A shiver ran down his spine. The basement was Jenna's least favorite part of the house. Growing up, she'd refused to go down there, saying it gave her the creeps. Why would she suddenly be there now? "Jenna, are you okay?" he called out, moving toward the basement door. No answer. The uneasy silence was broken only by the faint sound of wind outside. Gripping the cold brass doorknob, Aaron hesitated before pulling the door open. A rush of chilled air greeted him, along with the faint smell of mildew. The basement light, a single exposed bulb, flickered faintly at the bottom of the stairs. "Jenna?" he called again, his voice trembling slightly. Still no response. Aaron grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight. Slowly, he descended the creaking steps, his light cutting through the thick darkness. The basement was cluttered with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and an unused washer and dryer. He scanned the room, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Just as he was about to head back upstairs, he heard it again, Jenna's voice. "Aaron, help me." This time, the voice came from deeper in the basement, behind an old wooden storage door. Aaron's stomach twisted in knots. His instincts screamed for him to leave, but the familiarity of his sister's voice kept him rooted. He couldn't shake the thought that Jenna might actually be in trouble. He approached the storage door cautiously, the beam of his flashlight trembling with his hand. The door creaked as he opened it, revealing a small, windowless room filled with cobwebs and discarded junk. His light swept across the space. It was empty. Confused and unnerved, Aaron turned to leave. But then, he heard it again, louder this time. "Aaron, don't leave me." He spun around, his flashlight flickering. The voice seemed to be coming from right behind him, yet the room was empty. His heart pounded as he backed out of the storage room, slamming the door shut. That's when he noticed something strange. Footprints in the dust-covered floor. They were small, barefoot, and led from the storage room to the base of the stairs. Panic set in as he realized they weren't his own. Someone, or something, had been down here with him. Without a second thought, Aaron bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind him. He locked it, his hands trembling. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he nearly dropped it as he fumbled to answer. It was Jenna. "Hey, Aaron. Just checking in. How's the house sitting going?" she asked casually. His blood ran cold. "Jenna, are you at the house?" She laughed. "No, why would I be? I'm at my apartment. What's wrong?" Aaron felt a lump in his throat. I thought I heard you. Your voice. It came from the basement." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Jenna finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "Aaron, are you serious? You're not messing with me?" "Why would I joke about this?" he snapped, his fear morphing into frustration. Jenna took a deep breath. "Listen to me carefully. Get out of the house. Now." "What? Why?" "Aaron, just trust me. I'll explain later. Just leave. Please." Aaron didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing his coat and keys, he bolted out of the house, locking the door behind him. He sat in his car, his breath visible in the cold air as he waited for Jenna to call back. When she did, her voice was grave. "Aaron, I didn't want to tell you this because I didn't think it was real. But before I moved out, I kept hearing voices too. They always sounded like you or Mom, calling me to the basement. I thought I was losing my mind. That's why I left so suddenly." Aaron's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. What do you think it is?" "I don't know," Jenna admitted. "But whatever it is, it's been there for a long time. Maybe it's connected to the house. Maybe it's something else. Just don't go back inside alone." Aaron stayed at a friend's house that night, too shaken to return home. The next morning, he contacted his parents, who cut their vacation short to come back. When they returned, Aaron hesitantly shared what had happened. His parents, while skeptical, agreed to have the house blessed by a priest. For a while, things seemed to return to normal. But Aaron could never shake the feeling that the house held secrets far darker than he'd ever understand. Even years later, he'd sometimes wake up in the dead of night, hearing Jenna's voice echoing in his mind. Only this time, he knew it wasn't her. Whatever was in that house wasn't gone. It was waiting. It was a crisp autumn evening in October 2024 when Brian, a 15-year-old high school sophomore, found himself home alone for the first time in years. His parents had gone out for an overnight business conference, leaving him in charge of the house. For Brian, it was a rare opportunity to embrace the solitude, indulge in his favorite horror movies, and maybe raid the snack cupboard without anyone stopping him. Their house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by a dense patch of woods. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, but something about the encroaching darkness of the woods always unsettled him. Nevertheless, Brian kept himself distracted, sprawled out on the living room couch with a bowl of popcorn, watching an old slasher film. As the movie reached its climax, a loud creak startled him. He muted the TV, holding his breath. The sound had come from outside, from somewhere near the back deck. His heart began to race as he glanced at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The porch light cast a dim glow over the wooden deck, but beyond that, it was pitch black. He got up, trying to reassure himself. It's probably nothing, maybe a raccoon or the wind. But as he approached the door, his blood turned cold. There, sitting in one of the deck chairs, was a man. The man was middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and unkempt clothes. His head was tilted back slightly, staring up at Brian's bedroom window. What unnerved Brian most was his face, stretched into a grotesque grin. The man's shoulders shook slightly, and though the glass door muted the sound, Brian realized he was laughing. Heart pounding, Brian stepped back from the door, hoping the stranger hadn't seen him. He grabbed his phone from the coffee table, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, and Brian whispered into the phone, "There's a man on my deck. He's just sitting there, laughing." The operator assured him that officers were on their way, advising him to stay inside and lock all the doors. Brian obeyed, bolting the front and back doors before retreating to the kitchen, where he could keep an eye on the backyard from a safe distance. When he peeked out again, the man was gone. A wave of confusion and relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. From the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. The man was now standing in the backyard, his head cocked to the side, staring directly at the kitchen window. Brian's stomach dropped. He ducked beneath the counter, clutching his phone as he updated the 911 operator. He moved. He's looking right at the kitchen now. Please hurry. The operator kept him calm, asking questions to keep him focused. Brian tried to describe the man, but every time he glanced out the window, the stranger seemed to inch closer. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the kitchen window. Brian's heart stopped. He stayed hidden, holding his breath as the knocking turned into scratching, the sound of fingernails dragging against the glass. Then the laughter returned, louder this time, even muffled through the window. It was high-pitched and unnatural, sending shivers down Brian's spine. He heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, and for a moment, he felt a sliver of hope. The man, however, didn't seem deterred. He pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging up the window as he whispered something Brian couldn't make out. The scratching stopped abruptly, and Brian dared to peek. The man was gone again. The sirens grew louder, and Brian felt a rush of relief as red and blue lights illuminated the street. He ran to the front door, opening it just enough to signal the arriving officers. 2 police cars pulled into the driveway, and 3 officers emerged, one of them motioning for Brian to stay inside. Brian watched from the living room window as the officers searched the backyard. Their flashlights scanned the area, but they didn't seem to find anything. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers knocked on the front door. "He's gone," the officer said. "We checked the perimeter, but there's no sign of anyone." Brian tried to explain what he'd seen, but he could tell the officers were skeptical. They suggested it might have been a prank or his imagination playing tricks on him. They promised to patrol the area for the rest of the night and left after reassuring him that he was safe. But Brian didn't feel safe. He double-checked all the locks and turned off the lights before retreating to his bedroom. He tried to shake off the night's events, convincing himself the stranger wouldn't return. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but feel watched. Around 2 a.m., he was jolted awake by a faint sound, a soft tapping at his bedroom window. His heart raced as he turned to look. There, standing on the roof of the porch, was the man. His face was inches from the glass, his grin wider than before. His laughter, though muffled, was unmistakable. Brian scrambled out of bed, grabbing his phone and running to the hallway. He called 911 again, his voice trembling. "He's back. He's on the roof." The operator assured him that officers were being dispatched immediately. Brian locked himself in the bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor as he waited. It felt like hours before the sirens returned. He heard the officers shouting outside, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the bathroom. When they finally knocked on the door, he hesitated before opening it. The officers explained they'd searched the property again, but found no one. However, they did find muddy footprints on the porch roof outside his bedroom window. One of the officers offered to stay outside the house for the remainder of the night, which gave Brian some comfort. But the incident left him shaken. The stranger never returned, but Brian couldn't forget that face, the twisted grin, the haunting laughter. Even years later, he avoided looking out windows at night, fearing he might see that same man staring back at him. He moved out of that house the following year, but the memory stayed with him, a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that hide in plain sight. When James was 10 years old, he learned how quickly the safety of home could shatter. It was a lesson he'd carry with him into adulthood, a reminder that danger could strike even in the places you felt most secure. It was the middle of a freezing January night in 2024. James lived with his parents and younger brother, Owen, in a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The streets were lined with bare trees, their skeletal branches casting eerie shadows under the orange glow of the streetlights. That night, James's world turned upside down. Around 11 p.m., his parents received a phone call. It was a neighbor, frantically explaining that Owen had been hit by a car while riding his bike down the street. James's parents wasted no time. Grabbing their coats and car keys, they told James to stay inside, lock the doors, and not let anyone in. Then, they were gone, leaving James alone in the eerily silent house. He sat on the living room couch, clutching his favorite blanket and trying to focus on the cartoons playing on the TV. The minutes felt like hours as he waited for news. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every shadow darker. Then, just past midnight, the knock came. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. James froze, his heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his parents had made it clear not to open the door for strangers. The knock came again, louder this time. "James?" a man's voice called out. "It's your dad. Open the door." James frowned. The voice didn't sound quite right, too deep, too rough. And his dad always called him Buddy, not James. "I'm not supposed to open the door," James said, trying to sound braver than he felt. The voice outside grew more insistent. "Come on, James. It's freezing out here. Open the door, son." James didn't respond. Instead, he crept toward the window near the door, careful to stay hidden behind the curtains. He peeked out and felt his stomach drop. There were 3 men standing on the porch. None of them were his dad. One was tall and wiry, with a hood pulled low over his face. Another was stocky, his arms crossed over a thick jacket. The third stood closest to the door, a thin man with greasy hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. James's hands trembled as he backed away from the window. The man on the porch knocked again, harder this time. "James, we know you're in there," he said, his tone turning menacing. The boy's mind raced. He thought about calling the police, but realized his parents had taken the house phone with them. His tablet was upstairs, but the thought of running up there made him feel exposed. The men began trying the doorknob, rattling it forcefully. James's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were serious about getting in. He darted into the kitchen, grabbing a large butcher knife from the block on the counter. The sound of breaking glass made him jump. He peeked around the corner to see one of the men reaching through the broken window near the door, unlocking it from the inside. James bolted. He ran up the stairs and into his parents' bedroom, locking the door behind him. The knife felt heavy in his small hands as he pressed his back against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. Downstairs, he could hear the men entering the house. Their voices were low, murmuring to each other as they moved through the rooms. "Check upstairs," one of them said. James's heart felt like it would burst out of his chest. He heard the heavy footsteps climbing the stairs, growing closer with each passing second. The bedroom door handle jiggled. Then came the knocks, slow, deliberate. "Hey, kid," one of the men called. "We're not going to hurt you. Just come out and talk to us." James gripped the knife tighter, his hands slick with sweat. He didn't respond. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low chuckle. "You're going to make this difficult, huh? That's fine. We'll find you." Suddenly, there was a loud crash as the door burst open. The thin man with greasy hair stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. James pressed himself deeper into the shadows, trying to make himself invisible. The man walked slowly, checking the closet and under the bed. When he turned toward the corner where James was hiding, their eyes locked. "Gotcha," the man said, his grin widening. James didn't think. He lunged forward, swinging the knife wildly. The blade nicked the man's arm, causing him to yelp in pain. "You little," he growled. But James was already darting past him, out of the room. He ran down the hall and into his own bedroom, locking the door. The sound of the man cursing and the heavy footsteps of the other intruders filled the house. James climbed onto his bed and opened the small window above it. The cold night air hit him as he squeezed through the opening, landing awkwardly in the bushes below. He ran barefoot through the yard, his breath visible in the frigid air. He didn't stop until he reached the neighbor's house, pounding on their door until they answered. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, took one look at James and called the police. When the officers arrived, they found the house ransacked. The intruders were gone, but they left behind muddy footprints and a chilling reminder of how quickly safety could vanish. James's parents returned soon after, horrified by what had happened. They promised to never leave him alone again, but the damage was done. For years, James couldn't sleep without checking the locks on every door and window multiple times. He kept a knife under his pillow, a habit that persisted well into adulthood. The memory of that night, the broken glass, the men's laughter, and the feeling of being hunted, stayed with him, a haunting reminder of the night he came face to face with true fear. The summer of 2024 was supposed to be a time of renewal for Clara. After a messy breakup and a difficult year at work, she had rented a small, charming house in a quiet neighborhood to get away from it all. The house, nestled behind an overgrown garden, felt like a perfect retreat. But what Clara didn't know was that her escape would soon turn into a nightmare she could never forget. The house was old but well kept, with a backyard that stretched into a dense patch of woods. The overgrown garden gave the property a whimsical, almost enchanted look. Clara spent her first week there cleaning and organizing, feeling a strange but comforting sense of solitude. One night, Clara sat in the living room with a glass of wine, flipping through channels on the old boxy TV the landlord had left behind. The warm glow of the lamp made the space feel cozy. As she leaned back into the couch, a soft noise from the backyard caught her attention. It was faint, like the sound of someone walking through the grass. Clara froze, her heart quickening. She muted the TV, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, there it was again, the distinct crunch of footsteps. Setting her wine glass down, Clara crept to the back door, which had a small window looking out onto the yard. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The garden was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows over the tangled plants. At first, Clara saw nothing unusual, but then her eyes caught movement near the tree line. A figure was standing just at the edge of the woods. Clara's breath hitched. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing. They stood unnaturally still, almost blending into the shadows of the trees. Her first thought was that it might be a neighbor or someone passing through the area, but the figure didn't move, didn't call out. It just stood there, watching. Clara's hand tightened on the curtain as she debated what to do. Finally, she mustered her courage and flicked on the porch light, hoping the sudden brightness would scare them off. It didn't. The figure didn't flinch or react at all. Instead, it began to move, slowly stepping forward, out of the shadows and into the moonlit garden. Clara's chest tightened as the light revealed more details. The figure was gaunt, with an angular face partially obscured by a hood. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being yanked along by invisible strings. Her instinct was to lock the door, but her curiosity rooted her to the spot. As the figure drew closer, it stopped abruptly, turning its head slightly to one side as if listening. Then it smiled. The smile was wide, too wide, stretching across its face in an unnatural way. Clara's stomach churned as the figure raised one bony hand and pointed directly at her. A chill ran down her spine, and she let the curtain fall back into place. She locked the back door, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. 911. What's your emergency? Clara stammered out her story, explaining that there was a man in her backyard. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way and told her to stay on the line. She paced the living room, glancing nervously toward the back door. The footsteps started again, louder this time, crunching through the garden. Clara's blood ran cold when she realized the sound wasn't retreating. It was circling the house. The doorknob rattled, and Clara stifled a scream. The dispatcher's voice urged her to stay calm, but all she could think about was the figure trying to get in. The rattling stopped, but the sound of footsteps continued. Clara's mind raced. What does he want? Why is this happening? The sound moved to the side of the house, then to the front. Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. It was slow and deliberate. Clara, a voice rasped, I just want to talk. Her knees buckled. She hadn't told the dispatcher her name, so how did this stranger know it? I'm calling the police, she yelled, hoping to scare him off. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the voice came again, but this time it sounded closer, as if it were inside the house. Clara, she spun around, her heart hammering. The living room was empty, but the voice had been so clear. The dispatcher's voice broke through her panic. The officers should be arriving any minute. Do you have a safe place to hide? Clara nodded, then realized the dispatcher couldn't see her. Why, yeah, the bathroom. She hurried down the hallway and locked herself in the small bathroom, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The dispatcher stayed on the line, reassuring her that help was near. Minutes felt like hours. Clara heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and relief washed over her. But just as quickly, it was replaced by a new wave of terror. The sirens stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. Clara pressed her ear to the bathroom door, listening for any sign of the officers. Instead, she heard the faint creak of footsteps in the hallway. They were inside. Her breath hitched as the footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. The handle jiggled. "Clara!" The voice rasped again, this time softer, almost teasing. "You can't hide forever." Tears streamed down her face as she held her breath, waiting for the door to burst open. But instead, the footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Moments later, there was a knock at the front door. This time, it was followed by a muffled voice. "This is the police. Is anyone inside?" Clara didn't move at first, unsure if it was another trick. But when the dispatcher confirmed that the officers had arrived, she unlocked the bathroom door and ran to the front door. Two officers stood on the porch, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Clara unlocked the door and practically collapsed into their arms, sobbing as she tried to explain what had happened. The officers searched the house and the surrounding property but found no sign of the intruder. The garden, however, told a different story. The overgrown plants were trampled in several places, and footprints led from the woods to the house. But what disturbed Clara most was what they found scratched into the wooden porch rail. It was her name, carved in jagged letters, followed by a smiley face. Clara didn't stay in the house long after that. She moved out by the end of the month, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, years later, she can't look at a garden without feeling a chill run down her spine. And when she closes her eyes at night, she can still see that twisted smile and hear the voice that whispered her name. In the spring of 2024, Jessica, a 22-year-old college student, was in the middle of a semester-long internship at a small-town historical preservation society. It was an unpaid position, but it offered invaluable experience, and Jessica couldn't pass it up. The work mostly involved cataloging artifacts, conducting research, and occasionally visiting old properties to document their history. The town, nestled in the Appalachian foothills, was charming but eerily quiet. The streets were lined with historic homes, some beautifully restored, others in disrepair. One of these homes was the Addington House, a crumbling Victorian mansion at the edge of town. Jessica's supervisor, Mr. Lawson, tasked her with conducting a preliminary survey of the property. The society was considering purchasing it to restore and turn into a museum, but they needed an inventory of its current state. "You'll probably be there most of the day," Mr. Lawson said as he handed her the keys. "Take your time, document everything, and don't forget to lock up when you're done." Jessica nodded, excited for the chance to explore the property. She'd always been fascinated by old houses and the secrets they held. Armed with her camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, she set off for the Addington House. The Addington House was imposing, even in its dilapidated state. The paint was peeling, the windows were cloudy, and the front porch sagged ominously. Despite its condition, the house retained a certain grandeur, as if it were still clinging to its former glory. Jessica unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and old wood. Dust motes danced in the light streaming through the cracked windows. The interior was a time capsule. Faded wallpaper clung to the walls, and the furniture, though covered in sheets, hinted at a bygone era of opulence. Jessica's footsteps echoed as she moved from room to room, snapping photos and jotting down notes. The house was massive, with 3 floors and a basement. Jessica worked methodically, starting with the ground floor. She marveled at the intricate woodwork, the grand staircase, and the ornate fireplaces. But as the hours passed, an unease began to settle over her. It started with small things. The faint creak of floorboards in distant rooms, the feeling of being watched, and the occasional flicker of shadows in her peripheral vision. She told herself it was her imagination, a product of being alone in such a large, eerie house. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of her focus. The journal. While exploring the second-floor library, Jessica discovered a leather-bound journal tucked away in a drawer. The handwriting was neat but faded, and the entries were dated from the late 1800s. The journal belonged to Edith Addington, the last known occupant of the house. Jessica skimmed through the entries, fascinated by the glimpse into Edith's life. But as she read on, the tone of the journal shifted. "I hear them at night," one entry read. "The whispers, The footsteps. They're in the walls, watching, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. Jessica's skin prickled. She flipped through more pages, finding similar entries, each more frantic than the last. They want me to leave, but I won't. This is my home. If they want it, they'll have to take me with it. Jessica snapped a photo of the journal and continued her survey, though the unease she'd felt earlier had deepened. The third floor. The third floor was in worse condition than the rest of the house. The air was colder, and the floorboards creaked with every step. Jessica noticed strange markings on the walls, faint, almost invisible unless the light hit them just right. They looked like scratches, long and jagged, as if something had clawed at the plaster. She photographed them, trying to convince herself they were the work of animals or years of neglect. As she moved down the hallway, she came across a door that was locked. The doorknob was rusted, and there was no keyhole. She tugged on it, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of a door slamming somewhere behind her made her jump. She spun around, her heart racing. The hallway was empty. "Calm down," she muttered to herself. "It's just the wind." But the unease was now a full-blown sense of dread. The basement. Jessica saved the basement for last, reluctant to venture into the dark, musty space. The door was stiff, and it took all her strength to pull it open. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she descended. The basement was damp and smelled of earth and decay. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of who knew what, their contents long since congealed into unrecognizable sludge. In the center of the room was a large wooden chest. It was covered in dust, and the hinges were rusted. Jessica hesitated before kneeling to open it. Inside, she found old photographs, letters, and trinkets. Most of the items were unremarkable, but one photograph caught her attention. It was a portrait of a family, Edith Addington, a man she assumed was her husband, and 2 children. They all looked solemn, their faces pale and their eyes dark. But what sent a shiver down Jessica's spine was the faint outline of a figure in the background. It was blurry, almost indistinct, but it was there. A sudden noise made her whip around. It sounded like a whisper, soft and unintelligible, coming from the far corner of the basement. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the whispering continued, growing louder. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping and urgent. Jessica backed toward the stairs, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The voices grew louder, almost deafening, until they stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, Jessica thought she heard a single word, spoken clearly and close to her ear: "Leave." She didn't wait to see what would happen next. She bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. The culmination. Jessica hurried to gather her things, her mind racing. As she moved toward the front door, she noticed something chilling. Every door she'd left open was now closed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fumbled to answer it. It was Mr. Lawson. "Jessica, are you still at the Addington house?" "Yes," she said, her voice shaky. "Why?" "I just got a call from the seller," Mr. Lawson said. "They said the house has a history of incidents, paranormal activity. They suggested we reconsider the purchase." Jessica didn't respond. She was too focused on the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. "Jessica?" "I'm leaving," she said, hanging up and rushing to the door. As she stepped outside, the air felt electric, heavy with tension. She turned back to lock the door, but froze when she saw a figure standing in the third-floor window. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes dark, staring down at her. Jessica didn't stick around. She jumped into her car and sped away, her heart pounding. She never returned to the Addington house, and the Historical Society ultimately decided not to purchase the property. But the experience haunted her, and sometimes, in the dead of night, she swore she could hear whispers,